Okay, good afternoon. We're not ready. So we'll report back in a minute. Okay, we're back. Good afternoon and welcome to today's development charge public meeting. It is moved by Councillor Karen, second by Councillor Hunter. Be it resolved that the special council agenda as presented on October 23rd, 2024 be approved as circulated. Please vote. And that carries. Thank you. Are there any oh, no, we are going to go to our land acknowledgement statement. Councillor Robinson.
We would like to begin today's meeting by acknowledging the First Peoples who, for thousands of years before us, were and are still the keepers and caretakers of this land, where we now live and work, and in particular, the Chippewas of Rama, Wattamohawk First Nations, and the Moon River Métis. We are dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. We recognize all the generations of Indigenous people and their historic connection to this place, and we are grateful for the opportunity to gather here at this time.
Okay, thank you. Council, are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest today? Okay, seeing none. Now, new business. It is moved by Councillor Jorgensen, second by Councillor Morphy. Be it resolved that section 6.1.1 of the procedural bylaw be suspended to permit comments from the public regarding the proposed development charge. Oh no, I'm ahead of myself here, aren't I?
Nope, you're going to do this so that.
Oh, okay, sorry. From the public regarding the proposed development charges study. Okay, a vote on that. That carries, thank you. We only do this once every like 5 years, so I'm not familiar with how it's unfolding here today. So, this is a public meeting held pursuant to Section 12 of the Development Charges Act and is required prior to council passing a new development charges bylaw. The purpose of the meeting is to allow members of the public an opportunity to provide feedback on the findings of the development charges background study and the draft development charges bylaw. I will briefly summarize the procedure to be utilized for the public meeting. The Manager of Revenue, Rob Roselius, will advise council as to when and how the development charges background study, draft development charges bylaw, and notice of public meeting was circulated. A presentation will be made by Andrew Mirabella from Hempson, the consultant who completed the development charges background study. Staff will further summarize any correspondence on file. From there, presentations, questions, or comments from the public can be made in relation to either the information contained within the development charge background study or the draft development charges bylaw. Council will then have the opportunity to question the consultant, staff, or anyone giving presentations. I will now ask the Manager of Revenue to advise how and when the development charges background, the draft development charges bylaw, and notice of the public meeting were circulated. Mr. Roselius?
Thank you, Your Worship. I can confirm that the development charges background study was made available on the town's website on September 20th, 2024. And the draft development charges bylaw was also made available on the town's website on October 9th, 2024. Notice of this hearing was provided on October 1st in accordance with the Development Charges Act, and public input has been made available through Engage Gravenhurst.
Okay, it is important to note that council will not pass any bylaws this afternoon. The proposed development charge bylaw setting out the new development charge rates will be considered by council on November 19th, 2024. I now declare this portion of the meeting to be a public meeting. I will now ask Mr. Marabella from Hempson to proceed with the development charges background study presentation. Okay, welcome.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Mayor. Again, my name is Andrew Marabella from Hempson Consulting. Really, the purpose of today's meeting, as indicated in the preamble, is the statutory public meeting being held consistent with the requirements of the DCA. With the information being both the draft background study and bylaw being released in advance of this particular meeting in accordance with the requirements of the Development Charges Act. So a couple items on our discussion list. I know I went through this during the council information session, maybe in early to mid-August, but much of this is a similar context, but for the benefit of the public and council, again, as a refresher, we will go through it. We'll talk about just a little bit of the background, the legislative context. We'll talk about the background study in terms of some of the key inputs. The first being the development forecast, the second being the development-related capital programs. We'll go through the calculated DC rates, being the maximum permissible rates. We'll go through the rate comparisons that we have, and then we'll just talk about some of the DC policy considerations that are incorporated in the draft bylaw and some next steps. So just as a overview, what are development charges? What we're talking about today are charges imposed on development to pay for growth-related capital costs. It pays for new infrastructure and facilities to maintain service levels. We have to use DCs only for growth-related infrastructure and expansion-related activities. So we need to be careful that we're not using development charges to pay for regular asset management-related activities, replacement of existing infrastructure, anything that's not related to expanding services and required to facilitate development or growth. Under the Development Charges Act, it's quite prescriptive in terms of the way they could be imposed. The DCs are imposed via a bylaw. The maximum life of a bylaw is now 10 years after the day it comes into force, recognizing that some recent amendments in the Development Charges Act allowed that extension up to 10 years for your new bylaw, which will be the case for the one that will get passed. Prior to passing a bylaw, a municipality has to fundamentally do two things. One, we have to undertake a background study, which is the one that's been made public. Second, we have to hold a statutory public meeting, which is the purpose of today. Any appeals can be adjudicated at the Ontario Land Tribunal. So just in terms of development charges in the town of Gravenhurst, your existing bylaw 2019-91 was passed on December 17th of 2019 that imposed development charges for a range of services: library, parks and recreation, general government, which is for your studies, parks and fire protection, and public works, roads, as well as municipal parking, which has been removed as a DC eligible service since the kind of legislative changes since 2019. That bylaw had an expiry date of January 1st, 2025 as part of the last background study process. So a couple things that we do from our methodology standpoint. The first thing we look at is the growth forecast, looking at the amount, type, and location of development. That informs what the growth-related capital infrastructure needs are in accordance to facilitate that development that we're projecting. We do a very in-depth deep dive on your service level analysis in terms of the infrastructure and assets that are currently in place in order to deliver the services that we're considering under the Development Charges Act. We can't use development charges to increase that service level beyond that 15-year average. So there's what we call as a ceiling in terms of what DCs can fund, and they have to be to the extent of that maximum permissible funding envelope. That kind of feeds into what we can fund on a growth-related capital infrastructure need basis. There's a series of legislative reductions that we need to consider as part of our calculation. Grants, subsidies, any shares of the program that are not growth related that have to be funded from taxes or user fees, any available development charge reserve funds on hand, those are all considered for in the calculation of the rate. The remaining amount, after we make all those kind of adjustments to the calculation, we have our costs eligible for DC recovery, and the costs are delineated between your residential and your non-residential sector. Residentially, the charges are on a per unit basis. Non-residential is on a per square foot or per square meter of gross floor area basis. So you've probably heard about the development charge kind of legislation, effectively been a bit of a moving target over the last couple of years. The government's priority to address affordability and build more homes has kind of been at the forefront as part of their election mandate to build 1.5 million new homes by 2031. With that, there's been a series of housing bills, Bill 108, 23, 138, kind of, and a few others in order to facilitate that. A couple of them having a pretty significant impact on the development charge regime that we're in. So Bill 23, the More Homes Built Faster Act, introduced a series of exemptions for existing rental developments, residential intensification, provided a little bit more framework around how that could work. Nonprofit housing is exempt, discounted DC rates for purpose-built rentals. And then they also introduced the somewhat controversial phase-in, which effectively meant that all development charges imposed via bylaw would have to be phased in over a 5-year period. Because of the controversy around it, I think the government heard that, and then they released Bill 185 and got it kind of passed in June of this year, the Cutting Red Tape to Build More Homes Act, which effectively kind of walked the 5-year mandatory phase-in back. So to remove that mandatory 5-year phase-in as a result of it, and we no longer need to do that on a go-forward basis. Growth-related studies was reintroduced as a DC-eligible capital cost. The reduced time period for a frozen DC rate went down to 18 months from 2 years, and it provided some new notice requirements, which allowed digital options where local newspapers are unavailable. And then the affordable housing exemption came into force on June 1st of 2024. We are still waiting on the attainable housing components and definitions of what that would look like. So that's on the legislative side. On the development forecast side of things, we are working with the district's forecast, looking at about 1,280 new dwelling units over the 10-year period, most of which will be in the form of a single and semi-detached dwelling unit form. Our population will increase by about 2,780 people over that planning period, most of which being our permanent resident in that 10-year window. We see on the slide here kind of a population in new dwelling unit category, or at least line item, which is about almost 2,900 people. That's a kind of a very specific development charge calculation, recognizing the amount of new people that will come into the town strictly from the new growth or the new developments and the housing units that we have. So it's a little bit different than the census population because it takes into account the existing decline in the base. And then from a non-residential perspective, the rates are calculated on a per square meter basis. It's about 47,640 square meters of new building space that's going to be projected in the planning period, which equates to about 965 employees. Then we look at our capital program. The capital program is broken out here by the service categories on the left, from library, fire, public works, roads and related, parks and recreation, and so on. We have about a $65 million capital program at the gross cost. Then we have our series of kind of adjustments to the calculation. The grant subsidies and other recoveries represents about $5.3 million, and that gets removed from the amount that will be recovered from development charges. A significant share of the program, about $25 million, is not considered to be growth related, and those costs are removed from the development charge calculation, not being funded from DCs. Then we have our development-related column. We have about almost $2 million in available DC reserves, which are included for in the calculation. We have about $17 million, which is the 2025 to 2034 period. That's the amount of money that we're going to be looking to collect over this forthcoming 10-year planning period that gets included for in the calculation of the DCs. The remaining 15.6 million that's in the last column on the right, the other development related, is still growth related and can be funded from development charges, but it's not going to be considered in this planning period due to service level restrictions in many of the cases. And particularly what's driving that is your public works component, which is 11 million of that 15.6. So still growth related. We'll just have to fund it in the next background study due to that kind of maximum 15-year service level and that funding envelope. So what does that mean from a rate calculation perspective? The pie graph on the slide represents the distribution of the charges on a service area basis, and then the table represents the maximum permissible charges that are calculated. So for a single and semi-detached dwelling unit, it's about $13,875 for a single and semi. Your rows is about $12,065, and then your apartments are $10,420 and $71.28 respectively, based on the number of bedrooms. And then the pie graph, as I mentioned, represents what makes up the components of those rates. So about 54% of the Parks and Recreation charge is driving that service in many of the categories. Public works, roads and related, and fire are your next biggest categories in terms of the component of the charge itself. On the non-residential side, the calculated rate is $46.27 a square meter. As I mentioned, the pie graph represents the distribution of that rate. The one thing you might notice is the distribution of the charges kind of recategorized between the other service areas. Parks and Recreation and Library are not eligible for non-residential development, so the pie kind of gets reshifted to the ones that are actually attract the non-residential charge. So Public Works, Roads, and Fire make up a proportionally larger share of the non-residential rate. So what does that mean from the rates that are currently imposed versus the calculated rates? The current charge is about $5,768. The calculated charge is about $13,875, so representing an increase of about $8,100. I will note that the current rates that are imposed in the town are discounted and they did not reflect the maximum permissible rates that were calculated in the 2019 background study. So the increase that we're seeing here is somewhat artificial in terms of the rate that would have been imposed versus the calculated rate, the fully calculated rate that we have right now. But what's in terms of the total $8,100, we see your Parks and Recreation charge, fire, and Public Works kind of driving some of the increase that we've got. On the non-residential side, the calculated rate is $46.27 per square meter. The town currently does not levy development charges on non-residential development, and it's currently exempt, so the increase is an absolute increase of the $46.27. Council, through the bylaw and the policy, will have to make those determinations if they want to continue that exemption for non-residential development, or if they want to introduce a charge either at the maximum permissible rate or a rate that's different from that. It just can't be higher than the $46.27. So that is council's authority to do that at the time of bylaw passage, and you have complete authority in that matter. Looking at the residential rate comparison, and I will note here that the rate includes the upper tier charges and the lower tier charges. The district just passed their rates this week, I believe, and we submitted this presentation last week with the rates that were in place, so there's a little bit of a disconnect between maybe what the district is charging on their development charges, but we can reflect that and update that in the next, for the council report that comes forward later. Needless to say, the one thing when you're looking at it from a proportional basis, it would just shift all Muskoka communities in the same direction, so it wouldn't change your position relative to other district communities. But needless to say, your Gravenhurst rates currently represent at the kind of on the lower end of the spectrum relative to other communities, particularly on the lower end of some of the other district communities. The fully calculated rates would put you upwards kind of closer to the middle end of the spectrum. A couple of notable items here. The town of Bracebridge is in the middle of a phase-in schedule on their rates, which will go up to $19,600 at the end of the 7-year period. So they're kind of in the first phase or the first leg of that. So that'll increase every year. And the town of Huntsville is also going through a similar process, and their public meeting is next week, which are seeing increases higher than what is currently imposed in their bylaw, but those rates aren't in force yet. Other municipalities will be, potentially going through a similar process than as the town right now. But obviously that'll kind of just happen naturally as those bylaws come up for expiry. On the non-residential side, the charges again on a per square meter basis. The town's current rates, which are exempt, would place them at the lower end of the spectrum relative to other communities. The other District of Muskoka communities, with the exception of Lake of Bays, which doesn't have DCs, does impose a non-residential development charge. The town of Bracebridge has just introduced a non-residential development charge as part of their bylaw process, and they are being phased in over that same period up to 2657 by the end of the planning period. But they are starting with a marginal increase today and kind of putting that forward over the next couple years. And then similarly, the other communities have in the district have adopted non-residential charges, and certainly much more common as you get through to Simcoe County, Grey County, and obviously when you get closer to the GTA. Virtually all communities in the York region and such charge non-residential charges for development charges. So certainly from a development charge policy perspective, implementation options, the town's bylaw has been adjusted to reflect some of the discounts and exemptions arising from the Bill 23 and Bill 185. There's going to be some considerations from council's end when the bylaw comes up for passage in terms of the treatment of non-residential development charge, which is currently exempt. The draft bylaw has the rates put in them, but again, it would be up to council's discretion on how to proceed with those exemptions. And then there's other non-statutory exemptions input in the bylaw for places of worship, hospitals, farm buildings, most of which that I've identified are pretty common from a municipal DC bylaw perspective. But those are all considerations that the town would have in part of their implementation process. Any discount on the rates that are applied to what we've seen here in terms of our fully calculated rate would come in two forms. One, it's a reduction to the capital program, so we don't take the capital program in the same manner that we have. Or two, any revenue loss would have to be funded from non-DC sources. If we continue with the same capital program that we've got, means that the shortfall would be funded from your taxes and your user fees. So in terms of our development charge study timeline, we've completed a bulk of the work in terms of the background study and the public meeting being today. The intention here is to kind of gain information from the industry and council on the study results, and a recommendation will be brought forward from staff in terms of what the bylaw would look like for council's consideration, and it would be adopted, as the mayor mentioned, at a subsequent meeting from today in November. That concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions or comments.
Okay, thank you. I think we are going to hold council questions until the end after we've heard everybody's presentation. Okay. At this time, I will ask for comments from Angus Knowles from Loon Call Development, who has pre-registered to participate electronically.
No, that's the wrong one.
Pardon me?
No.
No, we're doing the virtual.
Good afternoon. I see Suresh popping up, Suresh Singh, the owner of Loon Call or LCDG, and I would ask maybe he go first if that's okay.
Is that possible?
Okay, yes, sure, that's fine. Yep.
Okay. Suresh Singh, Loon Call Development Group, 909 Davenport Road, Toronto. Mary 6 George, 2 Bob 7. I assume I had to do that. I wasn't listening on that particular piece. So I thought what I thought I would do is just present to council and whomever else is in the public and let everyone know what our company has done and is doing and continues to do in Gravenhurst and Muskoka at large. We are attainable ownership housing developers, and we are likely the largest private company that does this type of housing in all of the rural recreational communities in Ontario. And in fact, in Gravenhurst alone, over the last many years, we've completed 126 homes at price points that are far, far lower than what the market is. And Angus will go through and demonstrate exactly what those values are. And we are looking to produce another 131 in the community. And then when you look at Muskoka in general, we will be north of 500 homes of this type. And I believe council is familiar and staff are familiar with what we do. We obviously have been faced with economic challenges over the last 3 or 4 years, in particular from the pandemic. And when we look at what our cost impact has been through the pandemic, it was our servicing cost on a per lot basis went up by about $68,000 a lot, and our house construction went up by about the same amount. So about $135,000 of additional cost was borne on us, and we had sold 178 homes pre-pandemic. And quite frankly, we lost a lot of money going through that particular process. And we were one of the I'll call us honorable developers who did not say, hey, we can't build these anymore. We need to be able to get out of our agreements of purchase and sale. And we took everything to the finish line. Now, and then in the past, we've obviously been around for quite a while in Gravenhurst. And in the past, we've had situations where council has passed a lower DC rate, and we promised that if you lowered the DC rate for us, we would have it reflected in our prices, and we did exactly that. And that can be evidence from our sale price list back in, I think it was 2014 or 2015 that happened. So we in the past have always said what we do and did what we say, and we continue to be that kind of developer. Now, the other thing that's really important is, we're obviously in a big housing crisis in Canada, the province, regionally, pretty much everywhere. And when we think about housing, we think about all the different levels of housing. There's social housing, there's rent geared to income, there's market rent. Then there's that first step to ownership, which is what we would be, attainable ownership. And then you move up from there to the next cost level of housing. And without having all of the various steps in place, and ours in particular, that path to ownership, there's a real challenge for local municipalities, because then you just have to continue to feed the rental market. And in a lot of cases, it's rent geared to income, and it's very challenging and costly to do. So that can be a burden that the municipality or other levels of government need to team up on and continue to build. I know in some cases municipalities have become landlords, and unless those tenants are given a release valve to actually move on to ownership, they are perpetual tenants, and that means as population grows, the need for rental housing grows, and quite frankly, the municipalities and the levels of government generally just become bigger and bigger and bigger landlords, which I don't think is what is the business that the government should be in. I think they should be inspiring home ownership, home rentals, all of that through the private sector as much as possible. There are levels where the private sector cannot be accommodating, and that would be the social housing piece. We have a history of again not passing on costs to our home buyers. So right now we are looking to start selling our next phases. We have 131 lots left, and our next phase of 46 homes, we want to meet the same kind of price thresholds that Angus is going to demonstrate shortly. But if the DCs are going to apply to housing like ours, obviously we're not going to be able to do that. We're going to have to add these values onto the anticipated prices. And in Bracebridge earlier this year, when they passed their DC bylaw, they included a separate schedule for builders and developers who were prepared to meet certain sales price thresholds. And that had been done in the past. And quite frankly, in the past, in excess of 90% of the homes that were delivered in all of Muskoka that met the criteria were built and delivered by our company. And we don't expect that to change. So I believe if council were to say, yes, we're going to walk in the same trail as Bracebridge and consider doing a separate schedule based on affordability and ownership measures. I would be surprised if you're going to have a lineup of builders and developers taking advantage of it. I would be surprised if there was many more than us who are stepping up to the plate. So it's not a situation where it's a bottomless pit and everybody's going to be trying to race to the bottom so that they are serving a specific market. Because in the almost 15 years since we've been doing it, nobody has raced to that level, and no one has been successful in doing it, with the exception of less than a handful of homes in Bracebridge and Gravenhurst. So I think that's what I'd like to speak to, and Angus and Bob will move forward with the more data-driven comments. But thank you for taking the time, and I'll be obviously available for any questions that anyone might have. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. We're going to go over to Angus. Okay. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you. Again, my name's Angus Knowles. I'm the development manager with Lune-Col and LCDG. Same address as Suresh, 909 Davenport Road, 2nd floor, Toronto, Ontario, M6G2B7. So picking up where Suresh left off, when we engage in these public meetings for DC background report, our approach is not typically to try to poke holes in the methodology of the report. We know Hemson does this all day, every day. We know Andrew from in Bracebridge and in previous years. Our approach instead is to ensure that council and staff understand the product that we deliver that Suresh was describing in terms of attainable ownership housing, why it's important, and the support that we need from the municipality to keep delivering that product. So that's what I'll focus on for the next few minutes. And I don't think I'm able to share my screen, so I won't rely on that. But we had the pleasure of meeting with Scott Lucas, Ross Jeffrey, and Mayor Heidi Lorenz a few weeks ago. And we spoke to them about what we've been able to do in Gravenhurst. And that has been the construction of 126 new homes at an average price of $318,000. That's include a mix of townhomes, which the average price of those townhomes would have been $289,000, and 73 single detached homes at an average price of $340,000. So we've delivered a lot of homes, and we have kept our promise in the past where a reduction in DCs or the approval of lower DCs has been passed along to the purchasers. So we have 131 draft approved lots remaining in Gravenhurst, with a submission upcoming for phase 3 that includes 46 townhomes. And we would like to ensure we can deliver attainable housing there. And part of that is a DC program. So for the sake of time, I'll just give you a few examples that were provided to me from the Lakelands Association of Realtors. In 2022, the average resale price of a detached non-waterfront home in Gravenhurst was $722,000. In our G2 development, the average price for a new single detached home that closed in that year was $418,000. So that's roughly a $300,000 delta between the average resale value and the homes that we've delivered. Similarly, for townhomes, in 2023, Gravenhurst resale townhome average price was $584,000, and for our townhomes that closed that year, the average price was $290,000. So again, that's almost half of the resale value prices that we're seeing that year. And the other component that is not always obvious when we work with staff is the rising costs for us to deliver homes. It's a sentiment that's commonly cited, but not always clear as to what the impact is on the ground. So one example that we can provide is prior to COVID, a servicing cost, so the civil and electrical works for a home in Muskoka 2028 were around $40,000 per lot. In 2024, that number is closer to $70,000. And when we talk about hard construction costs to actually build the home on a per square foot basis, pre-COVID 2018, we were looking at about $90 per square foot. In 2024, we were looking at closer to $143 per square foot. So just to convey some numbers around the cost increases that we've seen. And so at the end of the day, I'm conscious of my time here, our request to council is to provide staff direction between now and when this bylaw comes to council in November, to work with us on a attainable ownership housing framework similar to what was passed in Bracebridge earlier this year. And I know Andrew will be familiar with that at Hempson from working with us and Bracebridge staff on that. And the idea there is a performance-based program that's based on price thresholds that we need to meet. So using the example of a townhome, in Bracebridge, a townhome that is sold for less than $450,000 will receive 100% DC forgiveness. For a townhome that's sold between $415,000 to $450,000, they'll be responsible, the developer will be responsible for paying 50% of that DC. And any townhome sold over $450,000 will pay full freight DCs. So that is an incentive and provides assistance to us at pricing that we believe that we can meet, and we believe that allows us to provide housing to young families in Gravenhurst that live and work there. There's a similar framework for single detached homes. Homes sold for $470,000 or less receive 100% forgiveness on the DCs. $570,000 to $615,000 receive 50% forgiveness, and any single detached home sold at over $615,000 will again pay 100% of the DCs. So this is a program that we work closely with staff to develop based on pricing that we felt we could deliver. And it does not exclude other builders. If other builders are able to build and sell at these prices, they would qualify for the DC waiver. And just really quickly, what we would do is after we sell the home, we would enter into a DC deferral and waiver agreement with the municipality based on the prices that we sold the home at. We would then build the home, close the home, and provide the legal transfer document that is provided to the purchaser at closing as evidence of the actual cost, the actual amount that the home was sold for. And based on that, the DC waiver or deferral would be confirmed. So that's a program that we have used in Bracebridge. Almost 70% of the townhomes we built in our most recent subdivision qualified for this program. And we would, again, just ask for an opportunity to work with staff to explore how this type of framework might work in Gravenhurst. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. I think next on our list is list. Yeah, next on the list is list. So, Mr. Bob List, if you'd like to come to the podium.
Yep, we're on. Thank you, Your Worship. Bob List, 103 South Bank Drive, Bracebridge. Papa 1 Lima, 1 Golf 3. Appreciate the opportunity to address you, Madam Mayor, and members of council and staff with respect to this. My comments were more of an introduction to the comments that were made by Mr. Singh and Mr. Knowles. So I'm going to be very brief, just to introduce the concepts of growth paying for growth and incentivization. Always in the submissions that are made by development charges consultants is the reference to the fact that development should pay for growth. And it's always cited in the documentation. And that is a correct statement to be made, in my opinion, and in the opinion of most. But the principle and the reality is that growth has always paid for growth, even when development charges weren't around. And before development charges, there were things called impost fees in some municipalities. The only one in Muskoka that had one was Huntsville. And they needed it because they had to put some sewage, to assist the district, put some sewage provisions into Hidden Valley. When the development charge, prior to that, growth paid for growth through a different mechanism. And that mechanism has been forgotten, notwithstanding that that mechanism provides mechanisms that relate more to ability to pay, just like just about any other tax that we have in our society today. One of the issues associated with development charges is that if you have a $2 million home, you're going to pay a development charge that's based not on the value of your home, but on the delivery of the service per se. And that charge is the same for someone that's buying a home at $300,000. That's not the way most of the taxes in our society work. I would encourage this council, not as part of this consideration, but to gather with other councils in Muskoka in the immediate future to review different methods of collecting fees to distribute the costs that we are all going to experience over the coming years in a more equitable fashion, in a like manner to that of normal taxation. The other point I'd like to make is that the development charges reviews that are usually undertaken don't, other than those which are mandated through the province in terms of affordable housing currently, they don't really deal with how to incentivize what we as a community are trying to achieve. And that's what Mr. Singh and Mr. Knowles just referenced to you. Was, can the municipality and should the municipality incentivize a developer or other developers that are prepared to deliver a product that fills a gap that's needed, that first step towards acquiring a home? I believe that it should be, and I encourage you, therefore, to consider what was being proposed. What was proposed here today, and I don't know whether or not it was mentioned in the consultant's report, is that type of incentivization, because the consultant's been involved in other municipalities that we build in, and yet that incentivization doesn't seem to be referenced anywhere, and I think that's a shortcoming. It's not a shortcoming in the sense that it can't still be dealt with, but I think it's something that should, in Muskoka, be referenced on an ongoing basis. I know that predecessors to this council in particular had a lot of difficulty in dealing with things that aren't detailed in the Development Charges Act. Almost boiling down to, is it appropriate for us to charge this kind of fee for someone that's coming to our community, wants to live here, is struggling to live here, and we're charging them the equivalent of 6 or 7 years of property taxes right up front to get a building permit? I don't think that's right. I think that if we look at the comments that were made in other municipalities in Muskoka about, is there a different way of doing this, that we'll come to a conclusion pretty quickly that there is, and we could strike out and create something in the future that is more appropriate to collect the monies that we need to collect. I thank you for the opportunity to comment. My comments are not just my own. They've been referenced in the paper that Mr. Knowles produced for this community, but also in a paper that were produced by the University of Western Ontario in October 2021. It was entitled "Reassessing the Case for Development Charges in Canadian Municipalities" by Andrew Sanction, Center for Urban Policy and Local Government. I would suggest that it should be required reading. It's kind of dry and nasty because it deals with the issue of development charges, but it is nonetheless a document, the first one that I've seen, that questions the way that we're producing and assessing development charges in Ontario, and it should be reconsidered. So I encourage you to read that and look at that. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Okay, thank you, Mr. List. We appreciate your comments. I am going to ask, are there any other members of the public here to talk to this today? Nope, I don't see any. Council, so this is not debate time, just we're here for listening today. But if there are any questions to staff or to our consultant or to anyone who's made presentations, now is the time to ask those questions. Or if you can't think of one now, we've got a month to the discussion. So, Councillor Hunter.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, through you. My question, I meant to ask this last time and I didn't, so I want to ask it today, and it's for Hemson. If we go to page number 16 on the slide, I noticed that some municipalities have school board and that ours do not. Can you just explain that to me? Is that 15 or 16? Like, it shows that some have school board and then none of them in Muskoka have that.
Yeah, through the mayor, certain municipalities, the Education Development Charge Act, they levy their own charges, which would be applied in addition to what the lower tier charges would have, and as well as the upper tier charges. The Education Development Charges, they can't fund any hard infrastructure. It's just land acquisition. So it just depends on the needs, and they pass their own bylaws and such. So it's very dependent on those school boards. Okay, thanks.
Did that answer your question? Yep. Yeah. Okay, Councillor Morphy.
Thank you, through you, Your Worship. I'm listening to what Bracebridge is doing in regards to certain developers, but it seems rather complicated. Are we able to just simply grandfather or freeze developers that are already underway with projects in our town?
So through the mayor, there are options you could do for developments that are already in the pipeline. So there's just a couple, I guess, caveats and I guess the ways you have to go about it. One, there's already some prescription under the Development Charge Act. If you've got a zoning bylaw amendment or a site plan application and it's deemed complete, those rates that they have are already frozen. They wouldn't be subject to the new rates as a requirement of the legislation. So they're frozen at the time of those applications deemed complete. So there's already somewhat of a process through the Development Charge Act. In addition to that, you can enter into Section 27 agreements, which are prepayment agreements, which could offer some form of relief in that sense in terms of the current rates. or done via the bylaw in terms of applications that are some way through the process. Just got to be cognizant of sometimes the way the application system works. They could come in with a subdivision application that's got all their units, phases over the next 10, 15 years, and you don't want to necessarily subject them all that way. So they got to be close to permit process is the way I would suggest it, but there's latitude in that under the act and the bylaw.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay. Anybody else? Well, I can see the reach. I'm just waiting for the light to come on. Counselor Jorgensen?
Then I will do it.
Oh, sorry, Counselor Morphy, did I see your?
No, I have a second question.
Oh, okay. Is it subsequent or come back around? Okay, so I'm going to go over to Counselor Jorgensen.
Thank you. I have a few questions as well, but in terms of the development forecast, I mean, 10 years is a long time for forecasting. And what happens if we get it wrong? That either there's a lot more development or a lot less in that 10-year period? How do we adjust for that?
Excellent question. So through the mayor, first thing is that usually the development forecast and the capital program are somewhat tied together. So in the instance in which development occurs at a much faster pace than what we've identified in the forecast, there's a chance that that means your capital projects also need to be advanced. So the money's coming in quicker, but you'll also likely be expending the funds quicker as well to accommodate the excess growth that's come in. In the inverse of that situation, if the growth is delayed, there could be instances in which some of those growth-related capital projects would need to be deferred or can be deferred, and you would time those projects with the growth that's coming in. Part of the reason why the 5-year bylaw was ideal from a renewal perspective is because you would be able to readjust your DC capital program and your growth forecast every 5 years during that process, recognizing that there's the 10-year window now in order to do that. Many municipalities might still be opting for that 5-year renewal period, just because you're going to want to track your development trends, your revenues, and your capital projects, and a lot could happen in that 10-year period, so you might want to update earlier. Hopefully that helped answer the question.
Okay, Counselor Morphy?
Thank you, through you, Your Worship. Okay, the second question, and this is the last, I promise. Can we be selective on setting DC charges based on price point? And if the performative can, prove that that was the point they came, so under $500,000, you pay 25% over, you get the idea of a scalable system where the lower the price of the house, the better of a deal they get?
So through the mayor, and that's similar to the way Bracebridge has structured it, and they had it based on the value and the sale price, in which the development charges would either be exempt or not. I mean, Bracebridge has that framework in place, so they were a little easier to adapt because it's been there for some time. So just keeping in mind that anything new, and not to sway any decisions here, obviously, but anything new, staff would have to be on board with how that would work, and there's some proof of purchase in terms of how to make sure that the sale price is actually reflective of what they want the DC credit for. So that's why there's a deferral agreements. I think Angus pointed that out too. So there's some agreement work and some behind the scenes admin that have to get done to ensure that everything is in step.
Thank you. And just to be crystal clear, we do not have that in place right now.
Your current bylaw does not have that in place.
Okay, did anybody else have anything before I go back to Counselor Jorgensen? Oh, Counselor Cairns?
Thank you, Worship, through you. Just a question then, the statement was made that, about the DC charges being grandfathered in, and I know that Loon Call has the development and is going on to the next phase. Would staff be able to tell us if they qualify for the same, or are they up for the new DC charges at this point?
Mm-hmm.
We just have a little side conversation for staff to see who's going to answer this question, so just give us a minute. So I'll go to Manager Resilius and,
Thank you, through your worship to Councillor Karen. At this time, we don't believe that there's any discounts for Loon Call with respect to their development. They'd be subject to the DCs at the time they pull their building permits. As Mr. Maribel had mentioned earlier, we don't have, one of the options is entering into an agreement under schedule, or under section 27 of the DCA, which the town does not have with Loon Call at this time.
okay. Now I'm going to go back to Councillor Jorgensen.
Thank you. This is a question for staff at this point in terms of the capital program going forward. In the budgeting process, are we basing that capital program on the full implementation of as recommended, or how has that been calculated going forward? I mean, it's really a budget question, but I think it's relevant to this discussion.
Mr. Jeffrey, yep.
Yes, through you, Madam Mayor, to Councillor Jorgensen. Yes, we're right in the throes of our capital budgeting right now, which is proving very challenging. We have bumped up our assumptions for development charges based on our 3-year average. And really that's a guesstimate at this time, of course, because we don't know what the full impact is going to be of some of the exemptions and the discounts that have been legislated by the provincial level. So right now, yes, we'd love to bump up our assumptions for development charges going forward, but right now a lot of that growth is status quo is going to come from taxation. By far the biggest funder will come from taxation and not from government grants or any other alternative funding source. So yes, we're from a capital budgeting point of view, we're very interested and we're very hopeful with for development charges and some relief that would.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? I have a question, if I may. One is for Mr. List. I guess when I hear the breakdown, I'm not sure that Mr. Knowles is still online with us, but when I hear the breakdown, upwards of $700,000 being attainable, I mean, and we're talking about a percentage of that, as far as the development fee goes. Is it all or nothing with your proposal, or is it, because I could see giving a break on a house under 400,000 or living accommodations under 400, but when it gets up to around, between 6 and 7, it's hard to say that extra $4,000 in development charges is really going to break or make somebody making that kind of purchase. So I guess that's my question to the developer that's here. And then I have one question for staff after that. So I'll go to Mr. Singh, I guess. Thank you.
Yes. Hi. Yeah, we would take no offense. What we would suggest is a tiered approach, like in Bracebridge. Yes, we can exclude the singles, and if it were on the town home side, and it is really, really, really hard to deliver a home now with a 3 in front of it. So if you were to take that approach, I would ask that you took an approach of approximately 425, because I think that's actually achievable on a reasonable scale. I don't know that it helps the community if we're leaking out 1 or 2 houses. I think there needs to be enough where it's material, where we help many families move forward. So that would be my comment there. But there's also ways of half for a certain range and zero for a certain number as well. It's not complicated to schedule because we can provide the one from Bracebridge, so it is a pretty simple schedule. But that's what I would ask. So yes, can be done. To be realistic, I think 425 is or even 420 is a realistic number that we could deliver on.
Okay, thank you for that. My other question, did you want to add to that, Mr. List?
Your worship, just a point of clarification to your question. The documentation that was prepared, and I believe is in the hands of certain of your staff here, does not say what you said, which was the 722. That 722 figure is a figure which is obtained from the Muskoka, I believe, Real Estate Board or whatever Angus referred to. And that's the price that the average single detached price in Gravenhurst. What Lune-Call is proposing is a reduced or no development charge at the point of $418,000 to a point, I believe Angus said, of $455,000. And all that documentation your staff has. So I didn't want you to be left with the impression that there was any suggestion that a home that was selling at $700,000 would be even remotely considered for development charge relief.
Oh, I thought that he had said between 600 and 700 it would go to a certain percentage. Maybe I misheard him. But anyway, it doesn't matter. That's splitting, you know, I thought that's what I'd heard. That's why I was like, oh, you know, I think it's realistic to say, but when he was talking about the singles, I thought he had said between 600 and 680 or something. Anyway, doesn't matter.
I have the chart here.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I encourage you to look at it with your staff.
Sure.
Thanks.
Okay. Now, my other question is when we look at that pie chart and we see such a large percentage of development charges going to recreation, and I always say needs and wants. Sure, do we want to expand our parks and our trails and all of that? Of course we do. However, it's not the same as saying, do we have the fire needs that we need? Do we have the library that we want, you know, to service a lot of our vulnerable population, things like that. So is there a way to bring the general development charge by saying we only want 30% of that 54% in that section of the pie? Is that like, and I understand, that's by project? Can somebody just explain to me why that is so high, and if it's possible to sort of bring that slice of the pie smaller?
So through the mayor, I can start and then maybe staff can supplement it on the specific projects. So the Parks and Recreation capital in that particular instance is comprised of all obviously new growth related projects, but it also does include the repayment of existing debt on the aquatic center. And that debt is also made up into the repayment of the DC because it was growth related at the time. It continues to be growth related. So if there's opportunities for staff to look at the project list and obviously something that's on the books existing, those would be the elements in which you could look at. Obviously, the existing debt payments are already in your budgeting process on a day-to-day basis, but it is growth related, and there's a share that we're accounting for in terms of our future DC collections. So that's one area that does make up a sizable portion of the total.
Okay.
If that helps clarify a little bit.
Great, thank you. Mr. Jeffrey, did you want to add something?
Yes, through you, Madam Mayor. Absolutely, that was one of our options that will be in our report coming to council in November is the calculation with taking out the the debenture payments, which are already built into our budget. So if we wanted to see or needed help to get our tax rate down, we can get some assistance from development charges, but they're already built into the status quo. They would, so we could have an option where we provide a different set of projects. One of the projects being just to finance those debenture payments. We could provide an option that without that, and it would greatly reduce the calculated rate.
Councillor Jorgensen, you had something?
Thank you, Your Worship. I've just got one specific question about the bylaw, and I believe I saw garden suites. Now, are garden suites not considered an ARU and therefore exempt, or how does that work? Or how do ARUs, how are they handled with the new legislation, I guess is my question.
So through the mayor, any intensification of existing residential units, so the additional, the ARUs, up to 3 units, are exempt by way of the DCA. So that could be, if you have a single-family detached home, you put a basement apartment in, that would be exempt. You can have an accessory unit separate to it, and that could be exempt, but you can't have a total of more than 3 units. If there's any particular reference to maybe a garden suite in the draft, it might have just been a carryover from before. We may have to look at adjusting that as part of but either way, whether it's in the bylaw or not, the legislation overrides it and it would be exempt, as long as it meets the ARU definitions.
Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
It is in the draft.
Okay, did you have another question, or you just? Okay.
So this may be, various people could jump in on answer this one, but I'm very much in support of the kind of sliding scale thing that we're talking about, but and in fact would support the maximum for the maximum, more expensive, but could we also implement it in terms of a percentage of some market price? Because today it might be $425, but in 5 years, as Mr. Singh said, his costs had jumped dramatically after COVID. So putting in a fixed amount like that may be irrelevant in 2 years. We don't know that you couldn't meet that lower market rate for whatever reason. So that question, and I guess the question to staff is, how do we need to give direction to staff to implement some kind of a sliding scale so that we're not presented and have to change it after the bylaw is presented to us?
Well, I think that the bylaw, if you want to propose an amendment, I think that's, or talk to staff and offer, a suggestion, or they're listening, so maybe they'll bring us an option. I don't know, Mr. Lucas?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think, of course, the purpose of today is the public meeting portion. So we've met with Loon Call with respect to their proposal. It's eerily similar to the town of Bracebridge. We're evaluating that. We've contacted the District of Muskoka as the housing authority in this region to determine what, if any, incentive framework they plan to or have included in their DC bylaw. Our original thought was to give consideration to following suit with their program. So we've made some inquiries about what that might look like, similarly with the town of Bracebridge. So I don't think we necessarily need direction here today to evaluate that. We're going to continue to do that. And as the mayor indicated, you'll have opportunities in November at least to impose something different. So we'll certainly look at, as we develop options for council's consideration, including some narrative around that council can give some consideration to as well, whether staff recommend it or not.
Okay. All right. Does there anybody else have any questions for anyone? Oh, there was a question on the sliding scale, like the general. Did you want to address that? Great.
So through the mayor, that's a good point, and that's something that we did consider in Bracebridge. The only issue is on the implementation, the administration side, the market sale price is going to continue to change. So it's very hard for staff to actually impose that and turn things around in a reasonable time. So we set the price as it was, and it would be constant. In the Bracebridge bylaw, we did put a trigger point at a 5-year point to have it reviewed. And if we felt that scale is no longer kind of reasonable, then it could be adjusted by the non-residential construction price index or some other factor, and the town could open up the bylaw and amend that schedule. But we didn't want to have kind of an open kind of sourced table with no parameters in it, because I think that would be extremely difficult from a day-to-day implementation standpoint.
Councillor Jorgensen?
If I could just follow up on that, it would seem to me that some kind of a benchmark, the problem is even the non-waterfront average price is skewed by, more valuable resales, of course. So it would be, if we could come up with some benchmark that relates more to the cost of building, or, land plus a modest, home of some kind. There must be some benchmark, I think, that the industry could provide there to make it a little more, or less onerous, I guess, to determine what that is.
Okay. Is there any other questions? Well, just one thing that I did bring up when we were talking with Loon Call is how do you know that you're not bonusing a speculator, like somebody who's just buying and renting, they're getting a deal through the town and they're charging, an astronomical rent to fund a rental property. So I think that's, and it looks like Suresh is going to answer that. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. We get this question a lot, and most of our the vast majority of our homes are owner occupied, and the ones that are not, the rents on them are quite average within the community, not in the sense of average on the waterfront parcels, but just for a regular rental. And the one thing that I wanted to point out as well is that when you look at the resales for the many hundreds of homes that we've delivered in Muskoka, the percentage rate of reselling is lower than the average rate within the two municipalities that we're working in. And we did an analysis on that a few years ago when we were going into another municipality, into Meaford. Their council and staff, their mayor, council, and staff did a tour, and we pulled up all of the resales for the preceding 5 years, and it worked out to about 1% that were turning over on the resale market, which, like I said, is far lower than the average market at any given time. Hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Council, are there any other questions? Oh, he's left. There won't be any. No, I'm just teasing. For those who watching, Councillor Jorgensen left the room for a minute. So let's get out of here while we can. No, I'm just joking. But Council, are there any other questions? Okay, seeing none. Well, I want to thank everybody for their participation. Thanks to Hemson for coming, and thanks to Loon Call for bringing your point of view. We appreciate it. Mr. Roselius, are there any other comments you'd like to bring to the attention of us from these proceedings?
Through to your worship, not at this time.
Okay, so I would just like to add, before I wrap up here with a resolution to council, if questions come up, staff is always open for conversation. Sometimes the questions hit you like 3 days later and you're like, oh, or if you're looking for some help procedurally, that's what staff is here to help us do. So always best to have a conversation, I think. Ask some questions and see if there's something that you've picked up on here today that you'd like to move forward. Always a good idea to reach out to see the best way to do that. So with that, it is moved by Councillor Robinson, second by Councillor Cairns. Be it resolved that the bylaw number 2024-107 to confirm the council meeting held on October 23rd, 2024 be passed. All in favor? Thank you. And I guess we'll just, Councillor Jorgensen, not voted. And then I'll just ask for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Robinson and Councillor Hunter? Okay. And thanks again. Oh, just vote on that, please. Thank you.